So I guess I wanted to start with, I'm actually, to be honest, I'm kind of relieved it's sort of an intimate group of us because I have several different things on my mind and I hope there's something that comes through cohesively. I wanted to start with appreciating that we recognized Hiroshima Day today. I know there was a little bit of back and forth email exchanges, which I actually did not. I just saw the titles of them. I didn't have a chance to read them yesterday. But I just wanted to share that it brought up a very strong remembrance for me at Yokoji Zen Mountain Center. We would always hike up to the ridge above Mountain Center for Hiroshima Day. And actually go a day before, spend the night, and then have service up there. And it was a burn area, so that's why it was selected as a place to go. And in the last summer of his life, Maezumi Roshi actually hiked up there with us, which he hadn't done before in my experience. So it was very significant to him that the Sangha recognized that and memorialized that day. So I felt very appreciative hearing that in the dedication of the service this morning. So thank you. Thank you for that. So kind of where I wanted to start is I read an article in Tricycle magazine earlier in the week, which I will send I'll email a copy to Choa and people want that to be distributed. So you'll have a little bit more background in what I'm going to talk about. But it's an older article by John Wellwood, who is a psychologist that probably many people know about. He passed away, I think, about 5 years ago. And he credited himself in this article, and I think he is pretty widely credited with the term spiritual bypassing. So the article is about really the relative and the absolute, which is inherent to the Heart Sutra. Form is emptiness, emptiness is form. And then obviously we chant the identity of relative and absolute. So it's a foundational aspect of our practice. This aspect of our humanity, and then our beyond just our humanity. And I do encourage you to read the article because I felt like it is, there's so many dimensions that he articulates, and it's an excerpt from the book Toward a Psychology of Awakening, Buddhism, Psychotherapy, and the Path of Personal and Spiritual Transformation, which is also, I think this was published maybe in the early 90s. So it's not a recent book. So I'll just read you just one little thing from the beginning of the article. Realization is the movement from personality to being, the direct recognition of one's ultimate nature, leading towards liberation from the conditioned self. Well, actualization refers to how we integrate that realization in all the situations of our life. And that really, basically sums up practice in a lot of ways. And in my experience, I feel that the maturation in some ways in relatively recent times, like just in my tenure of experience in Zen, is this recognition of our humanity, and that we need to integrate our sense of individual self with our ambitions and our experience of transformation and transcending just the sense of individual self. And of course, we have that very famous line from, I believe, the Genjo Koan from Dogen Zenji of to study Buddhism is to study the self, and to study the self is to forget the self, and to forget the self is to be enlightened by the 10,000 things. And then it goes on from there, which is actually considered to be the 5 ranks as well. So many of us, including myself, come to practice wanting to skip over that part of studying the self. I just want to forget the self. I want to get outside of this container that feels at times oppressive, confining, unending, with our conditioning and our personality. And so many of us come to practice with the sort of from the promise of to forget the self. I want to feel bigger than this limited sense of self, which is good. That's a healthy ambition for us. But I think historically there was not I could be speaking unfairly, but maybe not as much emphasis on the study of the self part, and not as much tools as we have contemporarily for doing that. And in a sense, not as much permission that is actually a very important part of our practice. And John Wellwood, in talking about spiritual bypassing, because he was very drawn to transcendence, transformation, in his draw to studying Zen and being a Zen student in the 60s and 70s. Very much along the lines of many of us, which is I want to feel outside, I want to feel bigger than this. And kind of came to see over time that and many of us have had this experience. You have all kinds of insight and all, maybe when you're in sesshin, and then boom, arrive back home and yell at your kids. And I remember this story. Jack Kornfield talked about having been, he was a monk in Thailand, and did very intensive retreat time, and came back home and within a few days was screaming at his mother. That sense of integration, and to give that integration attention, is really how we move from realization to actualization. So there's a lot in this article that I found also helpful, of why in the States, because that's all I can attest to, so many of us discover in practice, maybe before we come to it, of how much self-criticalness, how much self-loathing, how much not loving and being kind to ourselves is part of our experience, is like a very deep part of our experience. And I think probably also a lot of people are aware. I remember when talking about some type of event where the Dalai Lama was meeting with some Western scientists and teachers, and somebody asked him about, what is this about this self-loathing that people bring to practice? And he had to have it translated of even what they were talking about. It was, he didn't understand that culturally. Whereas for most of us, it's a very familiar part of our experience. And so Wellwood, because he is a psychologist and I am not, talks about this from a number of different angles of how that arises in us, which I think was super helpful. And one of the things he talks about is that a difference between some, and I'm just going to say this very conditionally, some Asian cultures and American culture, is around aspects of child rearing and how unconditionally or non-unconditionally children are loved and embraced, and how that sort of seeps into ourselves. But anyway, I encourage you to read the article because I feel like it has a lot to offer in this sense of understanding these two aspects of our experience, the relative and the absolute. And one of the ways in which I've termed it in the past, at least to myself, is that in some ways, psychological understanding is sort of understanding the inside of the box, right? And then, so we could term that the relative. And then the absolute is understanding what's beyond the box. And our life intrinsically, like we say in the Heart Sutra, form is emptiness, emptiness is form. Both exist at the same time. Both are present in our direct experience all the time. And that is our intrinsic enlightenment as well. So, so that's kind of where I wanted to start with this exploration of the relative and the absolute, and really would encourage you to read this article. Our sitting group here in Idlewild read it, and we had a very rich conversation about it earlier this week. So it seemed to have generalizable application for others and benefit. So I encourage you that way. And just another note on that spiritual bypassing aspect is that's also where we've seen and experienced that where people get in trouble in practice, where teachers have gotten in trouble in practice, in the sense that we think, oh, having some type of deep realization experience means that everything is cleared out and there are no blind spots. And we've clearly experienced that's absolutely not the case. So, so we sort of, in some ways, this is going to sound sort of intense in a way, in a sense, we owe it to ourselves and one another to not do the spiritual bypassing, to really see where our blind spots are, see where our conditioning is. And not that it's going to go away, in my experience anyway, but just that we become more skillful in how we work with it. So that's sort of the first piece I wanted to bring up. And of course, a ton more could be said about that. But this sort of like, there is a sense of like, I don't know, those Russian dolls of how I was kind of seeing this. Three things I wanted to share with you. So the second folds in on this, which is that I am taking a class through the UCLA program that I did on training in mindfulness facilitation. So I did that program, and now I'm doing a training. It's called Mindful and Awareness Practice 2 Self-Compassion. So I'm being trained to teach the self-compassion course. And why I wanted to bring that up is I think this is a very important tool in that, to study the self piece, so that we can move towards the forget the self piece. So, and again, because so many of us struggle with these aspects of being so hard on ourselves. And what I always like to say to people coming new to practice, and especially like through that MAPS course, which is completely secular based, and people may have no experience with meditation at all, and often will feel like they're doing something wrong because they don't feel peaceful and quiet. And what I always like to say is, mindfulness is about encountering our present experience exactly as it is. And for most of us, that is not pleasant and peaceful and calm all the time, even hardly any of the time, maybe. So we come in contact with what is, and that is our basic practice. So to kind of develop the word's escaping me right now, but yeah, to develop the capacity to be with our experience as it is. I do feel that self-compassion is super helpful, so that we can actually move into our experience with kindness and maybe gentleness at times, so that we can actually be with what's happening. So Diana Winston who's teaching this course. She's the director of mindfulness education at UCLA, the Mindfulness Awareness Research Center. And so 3 of these components are what the researchers have kind of found to be the core aspects of self-compassion. And I've talked about this before, but the first one is mindfulness. So the capacity to actually be with what's happening when it's happening. Self-directed loving kindness. So a lot of times we think of loving kindness practice as almost like tong lim, like we're doing it for others. So actually directing our sense of loving kindness initially towards ourselves. And then recognition of shared humanity. And I just think that this is inestimable. I don't know if that's a word, inestimably important. So much of the time when we get caught up in our own loops of the stuff that's troubling to us, in my experience, there is a commensurate sense of isolation that it tends to close in, and we tend to feel more alone with what's happening. And so it's also in my experience that I think that human emotions are shared. Like there probably is not anything that we experience that's unique. And so when we're feeling whatever we're feeling, to open up to the possibility that right at this moment in time, how many other millions of people in the world might be experiencing heartbreak, might be experiencing grief, might be just experiencing annoyance or frustration with some aspect of myself or my life. And just that sense of shared humanity can be a little bit of a counterbalance to the sense of isolation and bring in more sense of self-compassion. I'm not alone with this. This isn't because I'm so screwed up. This is part of the human experience. And then the last one that Diana has kind of innovated in terms of including is recognition of our inner goodness. And I feel I've always kind of, or in recent times, really felt this when we did the verse of the Kesa. Vast is the robe of liberation, a formless field of benefaction. And we are part of that formless field of benefaction. And so that, and especially as a counterbalance to when we're feeling really self-critical and there is this basic goodness here. And that is something that we're, I think, very committed to developing in ourselves. That's the flip side of wisdom in our practice, is compassion. And we're practicing the Mahayana way. We're vowing to be bodhisattvas, to bring everybody along, which includes this one here. So the recognition of inner goodness is the 4th capacity of self-compassion that Diana's teaching. And she defines self-compassion as the ability to be kind to ourselves in the face of life's difficulties and our own shortcomings. We care for ourselves even when we mess up, aren't perfect, and in spite of our failings. And I think that our experience is also that when we can actually do that, it's like it's like it immediately taps into our sense of compassion for all others. It's all connected. It's like you dig down and the tunnel goes out. And so it's not, I think that, again, a little bit maybe in our mindset of feeling like this is selfish. And I brought this up right at the beginning of the teacher training is, and she just, Diana just laughed and she's like, you're such a Zen student. Kind of like there's so much focus in our practice on non-self, beyond self, no self. So how do we reconcile that with this self-compassion? And that's a koan I'll just leave out there. I think it's extremely actually important to look at that, because I think otherwise we try to do self-denial, which really actually doesn't work. Because we're obviously leaving out part of the whole, which is ourselves. But as Maizumi Roshi would say, not the way you're used to looking at yourself. So the last thing I want to bring up, and I can see it's almost time. So super curious to hear how this is all landing for you, as my son would say, is I was on a week-long backpack trip. I got back, today is Sunday, I got back on Tuesday. And all this coming to the reality or a real life situation of had kind of a rough relationship, a rough, not even just specific interaction, but some roughness that came up between myself and a very, very close friend that I was on the backpack trip with. And how this relates to the relative and absolute, which is pretty obvious based on everything I've been talking about, but also for me personally, the eastern flank of the Sierra, being out in the wilderness, is a very visceral feeling of being in the absolute. Above tree line, 11,000 feet, it's just, and so to come all the way back down to how we communicate with one another, how we demonstrate respect for one another, how we hurt one another when we're not mindful of that, is this actualization. And to be honest, the situation is not resolved at this point. I attempted to have a conversation about it, thought that we had, kind of come to a meeting of the minds, and some of the same patterns recurred. And so that is a conversation left to be had. And this is our life, is in the nitty-gritty of the immediacy of things as they arise, and how we manifest our vow to be loving fundamentally. And to see how our pride or insecurity or defensiveness gets in the way of that. Because in some ways we could just say this field of benefaction is nothing but love. And it's non-specific in that way, and unnameable and ungraspable and mysterious, and the fundamental base of our lives. So I'm going to stop there. And really, really, really appreciate you being here. Really appreciate the conversations I got to have earlier. And just really a lot of respect and appreciation for your practice. So thank you so much.